Hello again. Welcome back to my course, Socialism, History of Socialism. Today, our lecture will deal with the topic of anarchism. I welcome you to read anthology, which I gave you to read as an assigned reader, Socialist Thought, a few documents on this topic. And next slide I'm going to show you shows you the essence of, so to speak, the kind of visual essence of anarchism. On the one hand, you can see the black color. On the other hand, you can see a red color. So again, the color of the blood, color of socialism, and the black color, it's a color of death, desire to die for, obviously, the ideals anarchists nourish. Okay, this is the color. This is the kind of flag. This is the these are the colors of anarchism. Okay, that conveys these ideals. Anarchism historically was a bastard child of socialism because, as you know, it was heavily marginalized by the end of the 19th century and in the beginning of the 20th century. But at the same time, there was a number of people who were sticking to the ideals of anarchism, and currently within the left radical community, anarchism actually is on the rise, and you might understand by the end of this lecture why anarchism is currently on the rise. Again, when I'm saying on the rise, we're talking about the radical left community. Okay, you will have to remember about three major things that defined anarchism, and I highlighted them here. The first, anarchism believes that the state is the major enemy. That's the major oppressor. Okay. Until now, we talked about different brands of socialism, and primarily we discussed the Marxian socialism, the most influential trend in socialism, where the private property capitalism was defined as the major enemy. Okay. The state was not defined as the oppressor. Okay, the capitalist state, yes, but according to Marxian socialism, state, if mastered by the proletariat, by working class people, actually could perform good things before it phases out somewhere in the future. Again, Marxists do not define when a state would be phased out. Okay, but in the meantime, they do recognize that a strong dictatorship of the proletariat, the strong benevolent state on behalf of the working class people should do good things for the common people. That's the message of Marxian socialism. Anarchists do not accept this premise. They do not accept. Okay, for them, the state is the major enemy. No matter who is in charge of the state, proletariat and bourgeoisie, it could be always an evil state. So they argue that the state, even if it is mastered by so-called proletariat, and again, anarchists share much of the Marxian doctrine about the class of oppressed, so-called oppressed, and the class of oppressors, proletariat, bourgeoisie, all these memes, Marxist memes, they do share. So they have a lot of common ground. But at the same time, again, the major premise of anarchism is the state, proletarian state, bourgeois state, any kind of state, it's a very oppressor. And the second thing, of course, private property is evil. Okay, and along with the state, private property also should be eliminated. That's how classical anarchism defines itself. And the third element, again, I highlighted these three things by numbers on this slide. And the third major thing is that anarchism believes in local autonomy. That is why autonomy is the key word for many anarchists. Okay, So local self-government, like ideally small communities, like neighborhoods, that in this anarchist utopia, they rule themselves somehow, they without any kind of state above them, they rule themselves, and that's the ideal. Okay. Historically, anarchism, which was especially popular during these years, from 1860s to roughly 1930s, okay. Again, we can say that today anarchism is on the rise within the left community, but we're talking about this period, 19th century and 20th century. So within these years between 1860s and 1930s, anarchism was quite popular, not as popular as Marxism. I repeat again, no. Okay. After 1900, anarchism was heavily marginalized. Okay, heavily marginalized. But anarchism was especially popular in Southern Europe, in Southern France, in Italy, in Spain. But it wasn't popular during these years, which I highlighted here. It wasn't popular in UK. No, it wasn't popular in Sweden, in Netherlands, in Germany, especially Northern Germany, Northern France, Norway. Okay, Northern Europe was never was the hub of anarchism. I'm not going to tell you why. Try to find the answer. Okay, and drop your answer in Dropbox, which I opened for you. If you can find the answer after you listen to my lecture, after you browse these documents from your reader I gave you to read, again, remember the reader called the Socialist Thought. So try to answer this question. Why do you think Northern Europe was not susceptible to anarchism? And again, I will give you a tip. It's also somehow related to spiritual life, religious tradition. Anyway, anarchism in the second half of the 19th century, not in the 20th century, but in the second half of the 19th century, and I told you once about this, anarchism was the major competitor of Marxian socialism. So these two currents in the world of socialism, two major factions of socialism, they were fighting each other, and later, gradually, anarchism was marginalized, and I think anarchism was totally marginalized and defeated during the Spanish Civil War, when Spanish communists and the Stalinists, on the orders of Stalin, they literally executed anarchists. So originally, during the Spanish Civil War, communists and anarchists and socialists, social democrats in Spain, they were fighting against the so-called fascists. It's a right-wing coup d'etat, General Franco, okay, who organized the coup d'etat against the Republican government of Spain, okay, freely elected Republican government that was controlled by socialists, communists, and anarchists, okay. But during the Civil War, particularly in 1936, 1937, communists, on the orders of Stalin, they literally unleashed the war within the war. So there was a war against the right-wing fascists, but within this war there was another war. So Stalin could not tolerate that the left socialist camp was not organized under his umbrella, and he ordered Spanish communists to physically annihilate anarchists, okay. So they were rounded up, executed, secretly murdered, okay, and Stalin's secret police was responsible for killing of hundreds of anarchist activists. There was a fight in Spanish Catalonia in 1936 between anarchist troops and the communist troops. They were killing each other, and about the famous English writer named George Orwell. Everybody knows, right? But not many of you might know that Orwell is famous not only for his dystopian novel 1948, or for his satire of communism book or fairy tale called Animal Farm. Okay, he was also famous for writing a book called Homage to Catalonia, 1938, where he described how he was part of this resistance against the right-wing coup. He was a volunteer from Britain to go to fight on the side of Republic, and how he was caught in this war between anarchists and communists. And he literally was on the side of anarchists and some Trotskyites. And his name was also was put on the death list issued by the Stalin secret police. So he was to be executed. So if you want to read about this fight, this mortal fight between Marxian left and anarchists, so read this book, Homage to Catalonia. It's a very powerful document which contemporary left hated. So they wanted to shut down Orwell, smeared him with dirt because they said, oh, Comrade Stalin was good, he was nice, because it was a Soviet philia. There was a lot of sympathies for the Soviets, as you know, 1920s, 1930s, and hardly anybody talked about this at that time. I purposely concentrate on this episode. Why? Because I want to emphasize that Marx and socialists, they heavily marginalized anarchists, okay? Anarchism, although being a faction of socialism, anarchism itself was divided into several factions, okay? And today we are going to discuss some of these major subgroups of anarchism, okay? Why do I put here these two colors or these two flags? Okay, I will explain to you why. Until 1960s somewhere, anarchism was primarily a left-wing political faction. Okay, it was collectivist anarchism, it was socialist anarchism. So different factions in anarchism, they were socialist factions, they were socialist oriented. Okay, and that is why I put here these colors, red and black, the traditional colors of anarchism. And under this flag, roughly, we can see many factions, so-called mutualism. Again, I'm going to explain to you what it means. Then socialist revolutionary anarchism, syndicalism, something that grew out of anarchism, guild socialism, a small marginal group that primarily existed, a tiny group that existed in France and in UK, that grew out of anarchism. But in 1960s, in our time already, in contemporary time, something changed that gave rise to different brand of anarchism. So at the very end, I will mention this brand of anarchism that grew out of socialist clothing, okay, that started to drift away from socialism towards something else. You know, that is why you see here the small, tiny, like flag colors of yellow and black, okay. Bear with me, I will explain to you what it means, okay. For the time being, just look at this slide and you will see this 5 major factions of socialism, okay. 4 of them are socialist factions in anarchism, and the last one has nothing to do with socialism, except the fact that it grew out of traditional anarchism and went beyond traditional anarchism, okay. Frequently, when you look at the symbols of anarchism, you will see that in addition to red and black colors of socialist anarchism, you will see a skull and bones. Again, that has something to do with this romantic cult of death, so we are ready to die for the cause of freedom. So that's this kind of idealistic romantic message. So here you can see Spanish, Italian anarchists who are in Spain fighting for the Republic in 1930s. Okay, the skull and bones. Or you can see on the other image an Ukrainian anarchist Nestor Makhno. Again, I forgot to tell you that anarchism was especially popular in Ukraine in 1910s, 1920s. Those of you who took Soviet Russian history classes with me, you may know why Ukraine became the hub of this anarchist movement. But again, the same symbol, skull and bones. Okay, it's a symbol of this revolutionary anarchism. Anarchists traditionally romanticize so-called bad guys, Robin Hood types, pirates, deviants, or social bandits. It's an expression of a famous leftist historian named Eric Hobsbawm, who talked about noble bandits, social bandits. Okay, Eric Hobsbawm is a UK historian who wrote a book about the social deviants, whom he glorified as the revolutionary class, criminals, bums, vagrants, pirates, okay, mafia type guys, all these classes of people who Marxists don't exactly like. Remember, Marxists loved the proletariat, but anarchists, they were ready to embrace not only the proletariat, working class people, but all kind of guys and girls who could be considered the damned of the earth. Remember, the damned of the earth. That's the expression that originated from the anthem of socialists called The International. And it goes like this: rise up, the damned of the earth. Okay, so that is why I'm using this expression. So for anarchists, the damned, all damned of the earth, they were revolutionary class, not only the proletariat, as in the case of Marxists. One of the prominent names who jump-started anarchism, again, you might see some other minor names, but for our educational purposes, I'm trying to simplify as the whole story to make it as clear as possible. I'm trying to single out the major figures in anarchism, okay, some representative figures of anarchism. And among the founders of anarchism, I would like to single out this guy, who literally, in my view, jump-started the whole faction. Okay, Pierre Joseph Prudhomme, a Frenchman, a working-class guy, by the way. Okay, literal proletarian. He was a working-class man by background because his father was a cooper, like worked with his hands. His mother was a housewife. But he was an apprentice in a printer shop. He became a printer, and that's what, by the way, opened for him the door toward education. So eventually, being a prodigy in the local area, I think he lived in a southern French town called Besançon. So local school board was fascinated with his linguistic skills. He literally, as a child, when he learned how to read and to write, he started to voraciously read. He was good in school, this elementary school, middle school. So he was sent to Paris to continue his studies. Okay, and when he graduated from again, I'm using modern day current language, what we would call a high school. He started to self-educate himself, okay, and eventually he mastered classical languages. He was a skillful linguist, okay. He is famous for writing this book, What is Property. He also is famous for this phrase, property is theft, okay. So Marxists, by the way, use this expression, but he did not, unlike Marx, he didn't call for the violent revolution. He wasn't obsessed with revolution, okay. He said, yes, private property was evil, it's horrible, everything should be collectivized, but we should go by example. So we should gamble on setting example for the rest of society. We should create these small communities on the ground, like small independent associations of people who rule themselves, okay. And these associations, by working together, by collectively owning property, they would set the example to the rest of society, okay. Basically, look at this slide. I included this phrase, which unfortunately not many biographies of Prudhomme emphasize. He was in many respects utopian, so a utopian guy. So he inherited much of this baggage from so-called utopian socialists, but at the same time he was more utopian than utopian socialists. How? Because he loved these experiences propagated by Robert Owen, creating these small communities. Remember, New Harmony, this type of lifestyle he loved. At the same time, unlike Robert Owen, unlike Henri Saint-Simon, unlike Marxists, scientific socialists, he distrusted industrial society. He distrusted the industrial order. So he believed that industrial order uprooted, undermined this traditional lifestyle, okay. So his heart was not in the new industrial society, unlike Marxists, because remember, Marxists, they criticized contemporary society, but at the same time, they embraced the world of factories. They embraced the world of workers, industrial workers. They said, yes, it's an abusive system, but we're going to harness it. We're going to hijack the system, and we're going to use this system to benefit the proletariat. So Pierre Joseph Prudhomme, he was on the side of those romantic people who hated satanic mills. Remember, we talked about this romantic poets, idealists who were upset that the new industrial order had undermined traditional lifestyle of artisans, peasants. Again, the ideal world for Prudhomme was the world of small communities of artisans, peasants, weavers, okay. That was lifestyle, okay. He was a famous proponent of local self-government. Again, that's one of the foundations of anarchism. So local autonomy, self-government. Again, hatred of state. We need to destroy the state, again, if not through the revolution, but by our own example, squeezing out the state from our life. Okay, that was his message. Okay, ironically, but at the same time, it's not ironical. Again, some biographers of Prudhomme or some anarchists, they're ashamed to mention it. During the Civil War, he actually supported the Confederate States of America. Yeah, he supported Confederation. I have to mention it. Why? On the basis of his concept of self-government, because to him, on the one hand, he hated slavery, of course, but on the other hand, he said, oh, it's a secession. They wanted to secede. They were fighting for state rights. See, and since he endorsed this call for local autonomy, for federation, so in his mind, it kind of overrode, I guess, his animosity toward the slavery. So that is why current anarchists, they sweep it under the rug. They will never tell you about this, okay, that he did support the Confederation again. And I'm explaining to you the logic of this. So why he did this? Because the Confederation seceded it, state rights. So that is why I'm supporting the Confederation against this Lincoln government that was a big industrial order. Again, you see, that's another interesting thing here. So in his mind, this northern states, they symbolize this evil satanic mills, evil industrial order that uprooted the world of small villages, this pastoral lifestyle. Again, the reason I'm telling you this is to emphasize one more time that how much romanticism, how much this, I would say, nostalgia for traditional lifestyle we can find in the socialism in general, in anarchism in particular. Okay, so it's some kind of call, to some extent, the call, let's go back to the past. Okay, that's life in some time, primordial times was better than now. You know, it's a romantic view of reality. Okay, Pierre Joseph Prudhomme is considered the founder of mutualism. Remember one of these words I mentioned in the beginning of this lecture. Okay. First, I want to emphasize that many of his followers, they took part, they joined the Robert Owen communal movement and co-op movement, and some actually former residents of New Harmony, they when they moved back to Europe, they joined Prudhomme because he argued that the local communities, that was the way out of capitalism. Okay, so mutualism. What is the mutualism, and why mutualism? Mutualism means mutual. So ideal lifestyle, ideal organization for Prudhomme was volunteer communities. Volunteer communities. Look, it should be not only collective communities. We admit that people should have private property. Okay, they should coexist with us. It's a mutual living. Okay, we don't need to kill them. We don't need to destroy them, like Karl Marx said. We have to phase out bourgeoisie revolution, like helter-skelter. Let's get rid of them. So Prudhomme, of course, he hated capitalism, but even though he said the property, theft, and all this stuff, he was not so, I would say, bloodthirsty. Okay, in his calls. Okay, he said we should, I repeat again, we should go by our personal example. Okay, market should exist. He even was ready to recognize that for a while market should exist, but it should exist without governmental interferences. It's an interesting thing here, because by kind of making this opening, small opening, later he opened a door to something else, which you will see at the very end of this lecture. Okay, of course, eventually he said market would be gone, because at that time many educated people, they believed that free market was evil. But only in case of Owen, we have to get rid of market gradually by encircling these marketeers, these whatever factory owners, by our noble lifestyle. We're going to convince the rest of society that they should follow our way, that all property should belong to public, should be owned by public. That's how eventually we would convince people to move in this direction. A credit should be issued without any interest. Okay, good, right? I don't know who is going to do it, but that's what he said. Yeah, I'm for credit. Okay. So mutualism is some kind of middle ground between socialism and capitalism, which the lifestyle which we should have before we completely switch to socialism. And again, these local communities, self-governing communities, autonomous communities, they would be united into confederation if needed, and they would elect representatives to this like national confederation in a country. Okay, but any local community would be free to secede from this confederation, because it would be a total freedom. So that was the ideal lifestyle, a social political system, according to Pierre Joseph Prudhomme. Another guy who was the founder of a militant trend in anarchism It was a Russian, an aristocrat by origin called, named Michael Bakunin. So he was the spearhead of revolutionary or socialist anarchism, revolutionary anarchism. He was a Russian aristocrat, troublemaker, rebellious nature from the early on, and also, like Prudhomme, a talented linguist. In fact, Michael Bakunin, who was a part of a small socialist club, underground club in the Russian Empire, he was arrested, exiled to Siberia. After he escaped from his exile, at first he traveled to the United States in early 1860s. Then he went to Europe. When he settled in Europe and lived there in 1860s, 1870s, he was very active in Spain, in Switzerland, in Italy, and he wrote in different languages by living in these countries. He spoke and wrote French as in near native fluency in French, okay, because all Russian aristocrats, they spoke French, so he was a master of French. He spoke and wrote German. He was able to communicate in Italian and Spanish, so he was, that is why he becomes, in 1860s, 1870s, the leader of European anarchism, okay? Especially when Prudhomme died, so Michael Bakunin comes to become the leader of anarchists of Europe because of his first aggressive nature, like a flamboyant type who always wanted destruction, who wanted to destroy the system. So that was his ideal. I want to destroy the system because any kind of order is evil, okay? Including the order which Karl Marx was going to create. Okay, that is why they constantly had these fights with Karl Marx. Okay, 1860s, 1870s. In fact, it was the time when in Europe, in the left community, we have this constant fights between those who supported Michael Bakunin and those who supported Karl Marx. Okay, anyway. The guy was a troublemaker from the early on. And in fact, if we look into his childhood, in his adolescent years, we see an interesting type that on the one hand was able to receive an excellent education, okay, like all Russian aristocrats. But on the other hand, we have this rebellious character who already nourished this destructive elements in his character. Ironically, which many general books on anarchism and socialism do not mention. For instance, I browsed our books, which we read for this course, and never found this information, and some other books never found this information. He was a very religious man, very religious in his early years. Okay, he was a die-hard Christian, a Russian Orthodox Christian. In fact, when in his teenage years, when he was young adult, he literally drove his family nuts. You know, they were not especially religious, but he wanted to force them to pray each day, driving them crazy. He wanted, he told them that I want to become an abbot. So he wanted, in the land estates where he lived with his parents and sisters, he had several sisters, he wanted to force them to read the Bible, okay? Was very anal about religion. And suddenly then when he was young adult again, there was a transformation in his character. Something happened, I guess. It's interesting. We need to study these types because jumping ahead, for instance, I see similar characters, you know, many characters like this, die-hard religious people switching suddenly to socialism, so finding the new faith. Okay, I can't make assumptions about why it happened because of personal traumas, because of personal transformation. Okay. like for instance in one of the chiefs of Bolsheviks, Russian Marxists. I'm jumping ahead here. Felix Dzerzhinsky, one of the chief Bolsheviks. He was a die-hard Catholic who was dreaming about becoming a Catholic priest, and then he became a communist true believer, really sacrificing his life for the sake of the cause. The same with Bakunin. Okay, we will be talking about these characters. Okay, now I just want to emphasize this point in his biography. It's very important. Okay, so he was arrested, and I again, after he was arrested for participating in a socialist club, underground socialist club, exiled to Siberia, he escaped in 1860s at first to Asia, then goes to San Francisco, United States, and then travels through Atlantic to Europe. He comes to Europe and immediately becomes the member of a group that was being created at that time called the Communist International, the group that was being created in early 1860s by European left to bring together all people on the left. And Karl Marx was one of the major spearheads of this group. It became so-called the First International, the First Communist International, this group. Okay. It was formerly called Working Class International Association. Okay, the first international association of socialists, so Europe and the United States. So Bakunin joined this group. Okay, and because of his speaking skills, because of his writing skills in different languages, he quickly, and his charismatic personality, he quickly becomes one of the leaders of this international socialist association. Okay. And the Marx, equally a charismatic person, equally a talented speaker, didn't like it. So that is why we have these two personalities fighting each other, and I will mention in a few moments this fact. Bakunin brought a lot of revolutionary activism into European socialism. Okay. Particularly, he became famous for this slogan: we need to do propaganda by the deed. So we should not put emphasis on the bookish knowledge. He was a bookish man, all right, himself, but at the same time he said it's not enough. We should be close to the street. That is why he always tried to befriend any kind of bombs, people who lived on the street, these outcasts, bandits, again, noble bandits. And we need to call people for an immediate revolution. Okay. In his mind, an elite group of active revolutionaries should kill the elite of society. For example, as far as Russian Empire concerned, he said we should kill the Tsar. We should destroy the Russian elite, this aristocracy. It's just a small group of people. We should execute all of them, and that's it. And the people would be free. The same thing we should do in the United States, in England, in France. The governments is just a small group. So we revolutionaries, we're also a small group. We are also a small group. But if this small group of people would eliminate the top of the pyramid, and that's it, people would be free. See, it's endorsing terrorism, actually. So that's what he was doing, endorsing terrorism. Okay. Propaganda by the deed, he said, it was important because masses of people, exploited people, they're sleeping, they're afraid to stand up for their rights, but we have to wake them up. We have to trigger sleeping masses to revolution against the state. So we have to empower them. Okay. That's something that sounds familiar, right? 1960s or some present characters. I don't want to mention their names. Anyway, violent elimination of private property. Okay, unlike Prudhomme. So we are going to violently eliminate private property. how we are going to destroy the state, and then we confiscate all private assets and make them into public property. That was the idea. So he did not, of course, suggest anything concrete. He simply said destroy, 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 but what come to replace it? He was very vague. He did steal from Prudhomme some ideas. Yes, associations of these free people. That's it. Okay, they should rule themselves. Confederation, yes, free people. Okay, but he put more emphasis on destruction. He hated Marxian idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat. He said, and of course he had some powerful words to say about would-be utopia and communist utopia, which we could see in the next century, in the 20th century, like in China and Russia and Hungary and Vietnam, you name them, different countries. So he said, Karl, your dictatorship of the proletariat would be more vicious and cruel than what we have right now. Again, I cannot say that I personally like this character, Bakunin, you know, like a helter-skelter guy, but I cannot dismiss his prophecy. He was prophetic in his vision where Karl Marx utopia would go. Okay, in this case we can say that he was a prophet in many respects, okay, predicting these outcomes of the dictatorship of the proletariat. I want to show you this something, you know, this cartoon from German socialist magazine, again, the Social Democratic Party that followed Karl Marx. Cartoon that shows how Marx eventually kicked out Bakunin. So it's a cartoon from a Social Democratic journal published in 1920s, but it's a very representative because you can see here Karl Marx kicking out Bakunin, and the Bakunin holds in his right hand this bomb. Okay, see, it's his prophecy of an immediate revolution. We need to bring all bombs, outcasts, proletariat, all kind of oppressed people under this big tent and lead them to revolt. Okay, without taking into consideration any circumstances, if they're favorable situation, unfavorable situation, just immediate revolt. And that's what Karl Marx didn't like, because remember, he had this quote unquote scientific socialist concept that capitalism should be ready for the revolution, there should be crisis, the society should go in its evolution through certain stages, and those countries which are still backward, like Russia, India, or China, which didn't have enough working class industrial people, they were not ready for the socialist revolution. So we cannot come and call these people to revolt against capitalism because they didn't have capitalism. See, that's what Bakunin hated. He said, oh, you're an egghead, you try to delay the revolution. No good. In fact, there was a lot of ethnic, I would say, ethnic animosity between these two persons, because Bakunin believed that Karl Marx was not only a Jew, he kind of used some of the slurs, anti-Semitic slurs against him, but to Bakunin, Karl Marx exemplified this cold, evil German who liked to put everything, to discipline everybody, an authoritarian who wants to line up everybody, okay, who wants to live by clock, who wants to kind of impose discipline. And Karl Marx, on his part, when experiencing the trouble making behavior of Bakunin, he called him cunning Russian, evil Russian. Karl Marx said, I hate all Russians. Again, he didn't hate all Russians, it just in a passion of polemics. And in fact, Karl Marx had a lot of Russian friends, and he even learned Russian to read Russian newspapers. But this particular personality, like charismatic personality of Bakunin, aroused his hatred because Marx hated him on intellectual grounds, and plus Karl Marx hated him on personal grounds because Bakunin was equally powerful as a speaker, equally powerful as a writer. Okay, although unlike Marx, Bakunin did not have any consistent ideas. See, at least no matter what we think about Karl Marx, about this concept, scientific socialism, whatever they produced with Engels, it was a logical system. Okay, so within their own world, they had this logic. Okay, they tried to fit it in the evolutionary theory of contemporary social evolution. But Bakunin didn't have any system. There's calls for evolution, whatever he wrote a lot, did not articulate any consistent ideas, and that's what eventually defeated him. He was popular among some marginal circles, especially in Southern Europe, but if you take Europe as the whole, he was eventually defeated. Okay. Another reason, and on the slide you can see another reason he was defeated was because the fight within this Working Man International Association, or the First International, the fight between Karl Marx and Michael Bakunin was also a fight between authoritarianism of Karl Marx and, again, I hate to use this word here because libertarian, to some extent, yes, so unlimited libertarianism, authoritarianism of Karl Marx, and libertarian notions of Bakunin. Okay, why do I hate to use the word libertarian to describe Bakunin? Because he was not, of course, a libertarian, because he did not recognize any private property. He wanted to destroy it, which was going against libertarian ideas that you have to recognize right of people to own their private property. But just for the sake of convenience, I want to stress that the fight between these two personalities was a fight between authoritarian notions, the centralized modernity notions reflected by Karl Marx, and this anarchistic notions on the part of libertarian notions on the part of Bakunin. Okay, and Bakunin was doomed to lose. I did tell you in one of my first lectures, remember when I highlighted the major trends in socialism, I did mention this factor, and I want to emphasize, because Bakunin was doomed. He could not defeat Marx. Why? Because in the hindsight, we see that all historical odds were against him, because he was going against modernity. The second half of the 19th century and the second half of the 20th century, it was the time of what? Of big factories, time of big monopolies, so-called cartels. It was the time of a big state. It was the time of these rising dictators, especially in the beginning of the 20th century. Okay, it was the time of centralized planned economy, when people, majority of educated people, were convinced that it was a group of enlightened masters at the top of the pyramid that should organize society. It wasn't some kind of deplorable masses on the ground who are unwashed, uneducated. Even some socialists who said eventually, yes, it was local communities, like in case of Karl Marx, association of free producers, they should take over eventually. But that's not how they viewed the development of society. That said, Marx and socialists, at first it should be a powerful state, proletarian state, that should suppress resistance of bourgeoisie, it should suppress evil classes. Okay, and it wasn't only Karl Marx who preached similar notions, it was people on the right who preached the similar notions. So across the board, for all kind of ideologists, conservatives, some diehard nationalists, in our case socialists. The most popular trend was to embrace the centralized planning, big state, monopolies, and again the faith in the enlightened masters who should control the state and the life of society. So we don't know what would happen in future, but in the meantime, it should be this group of planners, enlightened masters that should control life in the country. Okay, so that was the dominant notion, because in each historical age we have certain dominant notions. Okay, if you, for instance, go to our times, of course, currently, it's hard to self-analyze, but if we are honest, if we want to keep open minds, we also can pinpoint certain kind of general trends in our society right now. Okay, the same thing could be done, of course. Right now it's easy for us to do. We can think about what was going on at that time, the second half of the 19th century. And again, the major trend was this modernity trend, that big is beautiful. Again, I always emphasize this to make it as clear as possible. So that was the general assumption at that time. So there was not much room for people like Bakunin, who wanted to go local, who wanted to say the small is beautiful. So there was no room for them. Okay, that is why they were marginalized. Eventually, Bakunin was defeated. How was he defeated? So Karl Marx made a very smart trick, along with his friend Friedrich Engels. Okay, they in 1872, during this international congress or working men association, the first international, seeing that Bakunin had a lot of supporters, not the majority of the association, but a lot of supporters from Southern Europe, they said that oh, it's unsafe at present to have the headquarters of association in Europe. So let's move headquarters of association to New York, to the United States. Again, thousands of miles away from Europe. What did it mean? It means a slow death of this First International. And that's what they wanted, because they had the fear that Bakunin might hijack the whole organization. So Engels and Marx, in their private correspondence, right now we know about this, they actually wanted to destroy the whole association, the First Communist International, in order not to give this association to anarchists. Okay, because there was a fear on the part of Marx and Engels that this Communist International would be seized by Bakunin followers and they could use it to promote his ideas. So they moved, they had the headquarters of the Communist International moved to New York, and eventually it died because there was not much room for socialism at that time in the United States. In 1876, the Communist International dissolved itself. Okay, that was the end. And in fact, Bakunin dies at the same year, right? 1876. See? In 1876 he dies, and in Northern Europe his supporters were marginalized, and eventually in Southern Europe they lose support. Although for a while in the beginning of the 20th century, 1920s, 1930s, they did acquire some support in order to be squashed by Stalinist communists. Okay, but it's another story. So Bakunin was squeezed out, lost his influence, and across Europe it was Marxian socialism that became supreme. But still, even though it was the marginal tradition, revolutionary tradition of socialist anarchism, it was picked up by a few other people who developed it, and one of these firebrands who picked it up, developed further, was famous Emma Goldman. You may have heard about these anarchists. Again, it's hard to define here. It's cosmopolitan, I would say, revolutionary, of Russian, Jewish, American background, okay, who was born in Lithuania, then moved to St. Petersburg, Russia, then emigrated in the United States and lived much of her young adult life in the United States, again, internalized American culture in many respects, and then was exiled to Soviet Russia in 1990. Emma Goldman grew up in this traditional Jewish cultural realm. Okay, so she was discriminated, I would say, against from early on, because in the Russian Empire, Jews were discriminated against. They couldn't go to college. They couldn't be employed in particular jobs. Okay, state jobs, they were not open for them. So eventually she emigrated to the United States, where she was a proletarian. She worked as a seamstress, okay, with her hands. At some point, I'm skipping a lot of, it's a picturesque life. If you Google her biography, it's a very interesting biography, because in addition to contributing to anarchism, she also contributed to the feminist movement. Okay. She also wrote a few books where she exposed the Soviet regime, okay, which she originally loved. Okay. A very powerful expose, and I'm going to emphasize this to make a point. Okay, but before I emphasize this, before I make a point, I want to mention that Emma Goldman, like Bakunin, she was an excellent speaker, a firebrand. She actually, in her memoirs, she described the first speech she delivered in New York in the front of a group of workers, like she got the second wind and something was triggering her inside her soul. She felt this inspiration to speak in front of the people. And that's what get her going. So here I am using purposely this picture. There's a bunch of pictures if you go on Google, if you click images. But this particular picture, I chose this particular one in order to emphasize this trait of her character. Okay, that she... it was inspiring for her to speak up in front of the people. She needed this, like it was like a drug for her. Okay, it was her environment, to speak and excite people, to trigger them to do something. Okay, she picked up this notion of Bakunin. Okay, see, Bakunin was hooked on this slogan, propaganda by the deed. Okay, remember what it means, propaganda by the deed. It means we have to use terrorism. We have to use guns against people in the government, police, okay, and ruling elites in order to trigger the masses to revolt against existing system. Okay, and in fact, I forgot to tell you that Bakunin even co-authored a so-called manifesto, okay, which was called Revolutionary Catechism, where he described how revolutionary life should be lived, how a revolutionary should behave himself, so to do this propaganda of the deed. Okay, and along with the Russian student terrorist called Sergei Nechayev, Bakunin co-authored this catechism of a revolutionary catechism, where he outlined this propaganda by the deed. And let me quote for you. And late it became one of the foundations for Emma Goldman to act upon. So I quote, "The revolutionarist is a man under vow. He ought to have no personal interests, no business, no sentiments, no property. He ought to occupy himself entirely with one exclusive interest, with one thought and one passion, the revolution. He has only one aim, one science, destruction. Destruction." See, I want to emphasize this. for that and nothing but that. He studies mechanics, physics, chemistry, and medicine. He observes with the same object the man, the characters, the positions, and all the conditions of the social order. He despises and hates existing morality. For him, everything is moral that favors the triumph of the revolution. Unquote. It's a very interesting phrase. When I read this, when I was preparing for today's lecture, somehow this skipped me. In fact, some books say that he didn't write this stuff, okay? But in reality, he did participate in writing this document, okay? Simply, he did not put his name on this document, okay? The document, in fact, called the Revolutionary Catechism, was like an anonymous collective piece of work, anarchist manifesto, okay, that was printed and publicized among many anarchists, okay. Formally, it was Sergei Nechayev, this Russian terrorist, who issued this document, okay, and that is why it was attributed to him. But most probably Bakunin participated in writing this document because it totally corresponded to his ideals, okay. So you need to kill, you need to destroy for the sake of this revolution, for the sake of destruction. So this existing system should be destroyed. Propaganda by the deed. And that's what eventually attracted Emma Goldman, who participated in an act of terrorism against Henry Clay Frick. Okay, Henry Clay Frick was one of the known financiers, managers, financiers in the United States. Okay, at the turn of the century, and they killed him. She didn't personally participate in this assassination. Her boyfriend participated, Alexander Berkman, okay, who was put in prison for this. Although, I repeat, she gave a support, but personally she was not involved into this. She gave a logistic support to this, okay. She was under surveillance, of course, because of this. And eventually, when the revolution started, the First World War, revolution started in Russia, and in the United States, there was a campaign against these Red Radicals, 1919. So along with 200 other radicals, randomly picked up radicals, she was deported to Europe, and she went to Russia, since it was the area where she came from originally. So she was happy at first, because when a communist revolution took place in Russia in 1917, we are going to discuss this, of course, not at this point. I'm jumping ahead here. So when the revolution, communist revolution happened in Soviet Russia in 1917, she was happy, and many other anarchists were happy. They thought, oh, now it would be like free associations of toilers, workers who are going to control their own life. And of course, when he came to Russia, she saw the communist dictatorship that suppressed everybody, that dictatorship of the Communist Party that created this elite dictators who subdued the resistance of working class people, like peasants, everybody, and ordered them what needs to be done for the sake of revolution. So she immediately became unhappy about this. She said, oh, we didn't mean this, it shouldn't happen. Okay, it's the same story. She said it's not real socialism. Real socialism wasn't done in Russia, so Bolsheviks are bad. So these Russian communists are bad. And especially she was appalled, and I put it in my slide here. Look at this. She had to listen a speech by one communist bureaucrat in Soviet Russia, and he argued that freedom of speech is a very bad thing. It's a bourgeois superstition, yeah? That sounds familiar. Free speech is not good. And she disagreed with this. She disagreed with this, okay, because she was an anarchist, okay. Traditional anarchists, they did like freedom of speech, you know, unlike somebody else. Anyway, she was horrified by this, you know, how come? Okay. She was also disgusted with the Bolsheviks, who shut down anarchist newspapers because anarchists demanded freedom of speech, because anarchists said that the workers should have a right to go on strike. Okay. In 1921, some hungry workers were going on strike against the communist Bolshevik regime that was supposed to defend the interests, and Bolsheviks sent troops against workers to subdue these strikes. Okay, the last straw was 1921 suppression of the Kronstadt revolt. Okay, there was a revolt of red sailors. Again, we're going to talk about it because I need to bring it up to highlight why she became disillusioned with this Marxian. She didn't like it anyway, but how she became disillusioned with the revolution that was done on the basis of Marxian prescriptions. Okay, so she was disgusted with the suppression of Red Sailors' revolt in 1921. Kronstadt, it was a fortress in Russia, not far from St. Petersburg, where Red Sailors revolted against communists, these Marxian socialists, arguing that we hate the Bolshevik dictatorship. Again, Bolshevik, it was the name for these Russian communists who took over power in Russia in 1970. So they revolted against this, and they argued like Emma Goldman, oh, it wasn't real socialism. Okay, the Bolsheviks, this Marxian socialist, evil, so let's get rid of them and let's bring to life real socialism again. That was the message of Red Sailors, and the Bolsheviks sent troops against them and killed 1,000 sailors and put the rest in prison. So she became so disgusted that she and her boyfriend, the one who actually made an attempt, who killed Henry Clay Frick, okay, Alexander Berkman. So two of them stayed in Russia for a few years. So they became disgusted with this and they moved back to Europe. Okay, now it's very important. She comes back to Europe. She was very popular because she spoke different languages. She was a good speaker, especially in English and Russian. There's two languages she mastered perfectly. Everybody knew about her. Okay, she goes to Berlin, stays there for a while, then she travels to France, then she goes to UK. Okay, she comes to UK in 1924. Hundreds of people come to listen to her. Okay, George Bernard Shaw, famous British socialist. Okay, Sidney Beatrice Webb, again, we're going to mention these deans of British socialism, a bunch of Fabian socialists, a bunch of revolutionist socialists. They come to listen to her. A few hundred people came to a big hall in London to listen to her. And what she does? She comes and she begins to diss the communist regime in Russia. 1924. She begins to smear this regime, authoritarian regime, dictatorship, okay, telling people what was going on in Russia, okay, exposing the communist dictatorship. But what is important here, at first there was a silence in the hall, and then people started to leave in throngs. They started to leave, all these dignitaries, George Bernard Shaw, all these big names, reporters, okay, not necessarily communists, but like left intellectuals, okay. They started to leave, and the next day a bunch of newspapers, mainstream leftist newspapers, came with these editorials that this evil Emma Goldman smears this Soviet regime, or Emma Goldman attacks socialism. Yeah, she is not true socialist. All these Again, I don't exactly quote it, but the message was that how could she do it? How dared she do it, to talk dirty things about Soviet socialism? Why do I emphasize this? Okay, I'm using it as an occasion to show you the mood of the time, okay, to describe to you where the hearts of Western intelligentsia, where the hearts of Western intellectuals were at that time, okay? So there were certain notions, okay, about socialism which were totally shared by all educated leftists in the West, okay, and the Russian Bolsheviks with their big state, centralized planning, okay, with their modernity notions. They reflected these mainstream notions, but Emma Goldman did not fit those notions, okay, talking about the freedom of speech, other things, that no big state. It was not her time, okay. She did not fit in. I repeat, she did enjoy some marginal support, but not the mainstream. Mainstream socialists kind of laughed at her. She said, yes, she might be on our side, but she's no good. She doesn't understand how important it is to nationalize entire economy, so everything should be done by the central plan. Everything should be controlled by these enlightened technocrats. Okay, see, that was the mainstream opinion. Okay, so time again and again I bring to your attention this interesting point, that they meant to be marginal, these anarchists. It was not their time. Okay, and Emma Goldman shows this. Okay, in fact, she found herself in a very kind of peculiar situation, because people in her camp, they kind of hate her. They believe that she was not a true socialist. She was kind of fraud, deviant. But on the other hand, she was hated by the US elites and the so-called capitalists, the right, okay, because she was a socialist. And it was hard even for her to find a room, the place to live, okay. At some point, to secure her residency, she had to marry British anarchists. So she concluded a phony marriage in order to get residency documents in UK. Okay, and since in England there was no room for her, even though she received the British documents, she had to move to Canada, where at least the situation was not so toxic for her, because the left community ostracized her. To get you an idea, ignored, I wouldn't say ostracized, ignored her. A similar thing, I would say, happened with George Orwell, okay, who also remained a socialist. He called himself a democratic socialist, but who, like Emma Goldman, hated Soviet regime, hated communism. That is why he was ignored and despised by the left mainstream, where in the left mainstream at that time, not only communists, but many socialists and left intelligentsia, they sympathized with Soviet Russia. They did sympathize with communism, okay? Anyway, it's just a small detour I'm purposely doing at this point in order to give you some ideas about the place of particular creeds or factions historically, where they stood and what kind of popularity they enjoyed or didn't enjoy. The picture of anarchism would not be complete without me telling you about this guy, Peter Kropotkin. He was also socialist anarchist, but not as militant as these two girls I brought to your attention, Michael Bakunin and Emma Goldman. He was not a violent guy, He continued, I would say, this tradition of Pierre Joseph Prudhomme, only in a kind of communistic fashion. Okay, see, Pierre Joseph Prudhomme, he was open to all kind of lifestyles. He was even ready to recognize private property, like communities that would be founded on a private property, okay, that would be eventually, of course, squeezed out on this evolutionary scale. Didn't call for violence, and Kropotkin didn't call for violence either, okay. He also believed that we should organize these local communities, but these communities should be only organized on the principle of collective ownership. So that's where he disagreed with Prudhomme. Okay, it's always revolution. He did admit that revolution should happen, but it shouldn't be violent revolution. And plus, we need also to use personal example. And if it happens, if working class people want to do it, that's good. So we need to go there. Like Bakunin, he was an aristocrat. He was a Russian noble. In fact, he went to an elite officer school in Russia. He asked to be stationed in Siberia, so he didn't go there involuntarily like many Russian revolutionaries. But on his own, he said, I want to be in Siberia, because he wanted to do something for the people, and he thought he would be able to do something for the people. He was also a scientist, a geologist by training, so he discovered some new mineral deposits in Siberia, again, to do something for the country, to open new mineral deposits. He was a famous, at that time, geographer, who at some point was a secretary of Russian Geographical Society. But at the same time, he was a revolutionary, a socialist. And when authorities found out, the secret police of Russia found out that he was a member of an underground socialist club, he was arrested, and now he went to Siberia involuntarily. So he wasn't actually, he didn't go there. So he was arrested, but he escaped the arrest, okay, and escaped to Europe. Eventually he goes to England, and he permanently begins to live in England, since he been an aristocrat with a good education. He knew languages, and quickly he mastered English, and he actually becomes a popular English social writer. So writing on social issues, you know, very popular in UK. So he found a niche, writing for magazines, journals, okay, contributing to professional journals, geographical journals. In England, or English-speaking world, across the English-speaking world at the turn of the century, he became famous for writing this book called The Mutual Aid, 1901, okay, 1901, where he do not emphasize this destructive element of anarchism, where he doesn't put the stress on revolution, destruction, you know, everything for the sake of the revolution. He talks about anarchist lifestyle. So he argues that anarchism is something that had been embedded in the history of the humankind from the very beginning. In fact, it had been embedded in the nature itself. So the book called Mutual Aid is a story about the natural evolution and the human evolution. For example, he analyzes the colonies of bees, and he said, look, natural world, it's not only Darwinian struggle for survival, like what Charles Darwin says as the struggle for survival of species. The big fish eats small fish. There is another powerful side in the human evolution. It's when species help each other, they cooperate with each other, okay? And look at the colonies of bees, how they contribute to each other, how they breed, how they bring this nectar, how they create these colonies, okay? They work together, they, by natural instinct, they are driven by the instinct of mutual help. And that's what other animals all about, okay? It's not about the fight about resources, scarce resources, okay? It's in fact about the survival. Especially within the group, species do help each other in order to survive. And then he goes to analyze the Stone Age people, when he said this, Stone Age communities, they shared everything, they sacrificed everything for each other in order for their small communities to survive. So I guess in this case, logically, we should give him credit. So he said, yes, in addition to he did recognize that there is a struggle for survival among people who belong to different species. But he said, by talking about this, we should not neglect the other powerful side in the history of nature and the humans, the side that tells us a lot about the mutual cooperation. Okay, just to give you a short story, the gist of this book. And again, I purposely brought to your attention this picture. Again, famous American picture, you know this, right? Romantic painting that's called The Peaceable Kingdom. That's what it was all about in the mind of Kropotkin. That was the anarchism. Okay, eventually it would become not only a cooperation of species within these groups, but all people would use their social instincts to organize this mutual help among different species. Okay, so we kind of go beyond nature. We will use what was had been embedded in nature, mutual help, but we will extend to this interspecies cooperation. Okay, so wolves would become friends with lambs, right? Okay, so that was the future. Anyway, anarchism. Out of anarchism, a few other trends developed, and one of the interesting trends that emerged to be specific out of Marxism and anarchism, we have so-called syndicalism. In a translation from French, syndicate, it means union, trade union. Okay, syndicalism becomes a popular trend created by some anarchists who were concerned about how are we going to organize our life after the socialist revolution, after we destroy this private property, after we eliminate capitalism. Nobody answers it. So what does it mean to say free associations? So we need to have something like we hate, of course, hierarchy as anarchists. We hate organization, but there should be something how we need to organize or self-organize ourselves. So out of Marxism and anarchism, there was a trend emerging called syndicalism. Okay, the best way to organize our life in future would be to give power to trade unions. That's it. So that was the message of syndicalists. Okay, we are going to do a general revolution, but it wouldn't be like in a Bakunian way, the small elite group of Emma Goldman, a small elite group doing this terrorism, killing the bureaucrats, okay, and taking all the power and giving the power to local communities. Okay, revolution would be done through a general strike of workers. Okay, workers would go on general strike, and the life in the country would be paralyzed, and that's how it would happen. And then we will give power to trade unions. They also said the cooperatives should exist, so that's the social and political system. Okay, it was especially popular in France, Italy, Spain. In the US, you may have heard, those of you who took US history, there was a union in the beginning of the 20th century called Industrial Workers of the World, IWW. Okay, I think that's how this abbreviation was rendered, Industrial Workers of the World. Okay, that was syndicalist union, that they believed that all political power should belong to unions, who should run the state, who should run the life of the state. They would elect representatives to the government, and that's it. So power to the unions. The major name we have to remember here is George Sorel, a French ideologist of syndicalism. Okay, he believed that the labor performed by people who work for factories, it's not only something that created wealth. The labor is a spiritual thing. Okay, it's people who perform the labor, they're like noble savages. They perform, they lead a wholesome life. Okay, They're heroic people. Okay. So that is why they should have power, not the Communist Party, like according to Marx and socialists. Okay. They're the noble savage. They're the salt of the earth, right? Salt of the earth. So they should have power, which means unions should come to power. Sorel did recognize violence. He allowed violence. Yes, revolution, general strike. Okay. But he hated this Marxian concept of proletarian state. Okay. At the same time, he praised Mussolini and Lenin. He believed that eventually they would open the doors to power of the unions. Little did he know he died in very early 1922, I think, Sorel. He didn't see that Lenin dictatorship, communist dictatorship in Russia, and Mussolini fascist dictatorship in Italy, they became dictatorships. So the power wasn't given to unions. Okay. Originally, Lenin did say, oh, workers should take power. Mussolini talked about corporate power. So he did, Sorel, contribute to some extent to fascism, because Mussolini did say that I owe most to George Sorel, this master of syndicalism by his rough theories, has contributed most to form the discipline, energy, and power of the fascist cohorts. So what was important here is that Mussolini peddled the idea of so-called professional corporations. So he said people should be organized according to what Sorel suggested, that the power should be given to the unions, professional unions, okay? And these unions should include all people who work on these factories, okay? Workers, management, everybody. Okay, we shouldn't differentiate. Shouldn't be only workers. So he kind of took it a little bit further, and he did try to create this corporate society in Italy. But eventually, it became his personal dictatorship. Okay, dictatorship of Mussolini. There was a tiny group of romantic anarchists who also were concerned about how we're going to organize our life. Okay, we need some kind of self-organization. It was so-called guild socialism. Guild socialism is a pure romantic movement, mostly in England, like about a few hundred people. Okay, again, as I said, anarchism in general was not popular in England. A few hundred people, one intellectual exemplified this guild socialism movement named William Morris. Okay. What he was concerned about, and folks who promoted this idea of guild socialism, again, industrial order is evil, satanic mills were evil, industrial labor brings monotony, ugliness, division of labor. It was no good. Okay, how do we organize our life in this case if the industrial order was bad? So we should go to medieval guilds. Okay, so we should create this medieval type of guilds where would have apprentices, masters, okay, where the beauty of labor would be glorified. Okay, so copy medieval type craft guilds and recreate this structure in our new conditions, and it should be fine. Okay, we're going to elect representatives of these guilds. They would make up a parliament, and that's how we're going to live our life. A very romantic, this utopian view of society. Did not enjoy too much influence, died, of course, like syndicalism, like much of anarchism died, being swept away by dictatorships in 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. Okay. Finally, again, I'm coming to the end of my story. Again, now you will see why I mentioned the yellow color, okay, in the beginning. Okay. There were a few anarchists. At first, they were supporters of socialist anarchism. Okay. Among them was a guy, intellectual, an American guy, Benjamin Tucker. Okay. And in fact, what we're talking here about became mostly widespread in the United States, and you will understand why. Okay. So Benjamin Tucker was a socialist anarchist. In fact, a friend with Kropotkin. In fact, Kropotkin, Benjamin Tucker, American anarchist, and a few other people, France, Italy, Spain, they got together and they actually organized the Congress, separate Congress of anarchists, International Congress of Anarchists. Okay. But the question that was asked by Benjamin Tucker and the people who followed him, a few people, was very simple. Okay. And they were building on mutualism promoted by Prudhomme. Remember mutualism? The very simple question: if we recognize rights of individuals, communities, to organize their own life on the ground, why should we smear with dirt private property? Why shouldn't we recognize the right of people to own property? It's also, see, if we anarchists are so anal about individual freedom, we hate hierarchy, we hate the state. So why are we so anal about this? Okay. Why is it so evil? Shouldn't we take the logic of this, our anarchism, a little bit further to say that, yes, let's admit, some communities might love public property, like some New Harmony type guys. They come together, they own everything. We don't care if they would fail or they would succeed. But why don't you want to recognize other people to create life, organize themselves on the basis of private property? What if they love private property? Okay, some kind of farmers getting together. Okay, that's the questions. And here Benjamin Tucker clearly was building on powerful American, I would call it American traditionalism. Okay, quote unquote American blood and soil. Again, I have to emphasize, when I say blood and soil, it's like in a joking way, in quotation marks, because normally when we talk about traditional blood and soil, when you go to Europe, China, you will see that so-called traditional culture, it's like conservative culture that always glorifies this collectivism, conservatism, medieval type society. Okay, the kings and queens. That's how, at least, traditional European traditionalism is pictured, and it's correct picture. Or if you go to like China, other countries, traditionalism always glorifies this collectivism, glorifies communal lifestyle. Okay, but American traditionalism, at least to my knowledge, was had been grounded in Constitution, in individualism, in the free market. Okay. So that was the traditionalism. So in this case, Benjamin Tucker was building on the powerful American libertarian tradition. Again, if you want to learn more about it, you can Google Lysander Spooner, one of the famous 19th century American libertarians. Okay, sometimes he is also called an anarchist, so you will learn more. So the socialist anarchist Benjamin Tucker, he was building on powerful American libertarian tradition and merged this with tradition of European anarchism. And now, finishing my story, I want to jump far ahead. Eventually, in 1960s, 1990s, when socialism started to decline. Again, I'm jumping ahead here. I'm sorry, but I have to mention it in order to give you this complete picture of what happened with anarchism, about different factions of anarchism. I want to bring this to your attention that at some point, 1960s to 1990s, socialism was declining, went through a major crisis. Of course, right now, socialism again is on the rise, but at that point, people were hooked on these ideals of free market, individual liberty, autonomy, power to local communities. These were the popular things in 1960s to 1990s. Okay, and we have a new faction in anarchism. Okay, a strange faction which emerged in 1960s, 1970s. The faction that had nothing to do with socialism. See, building on anarchism, taking the precepts of anarchism and merging these prescriptions of anarchism with the American libertarian tradition, this faction of anarchism developed into so-called anarcho-capitalism. Okay, so people, at first there were, of course, only a few hundred of these people, but then more and more, and eventually by 2010 it became a powerful trend, at least in the United States and in other countries as well. So-called anarcho-capitalism, which never existed, okay, in of course in 19th century, never existed, because all anarchism was collectivist anarchism, anarchism that was socialist anarchism. And much of the 20th century this trend did not exist, at least until 1960s. It was all socialist anarchism. But now that see an interesting trend emerges that is called anarcho-capitalism. Okay, and it was not anymore. It's a very minor trend, of course. Okay, it's I would say some on the right, and that is why we have a new colors here, yellow and black. So yellow is the color of gold, money, and black it's a color of anarchism. And anarcho-capitalists, they embrace this flag, traditional American Gadsden flag, don't tread on me. It's a flag of anarcho-capitalists, and the person who, one of the major leaders of anarcho-capitalism is Murray Rothbard, a famous American libertarian who wrote many books, and one of the most popular books of his is The Enemy of the State, so you can Google it. And on this note, I would like to finish my story about anarchism, which I repeat, until 1960s was totally was developing within this realm of socialism. So it was a socialist trend. Okay, and in the hindsight, to summarize, to give a summary to my story today, yes, at that time before 1960s, and very much to the present day, anarchism, it's what at least 90% of anarchism, it's something that develops within socialism. Okay, it's a socialist trend pretty much, and that's how it goes. And currently you might see the reemergence of this trend. Sometimes it kind of manifests itself in a very destructive way, in this, I would say, in Emma Goldman, in the Michael Bakunin type, and some of these I would say groups or gangs of anarchists, they do something on our streets, and we will see how society will respond to their actions. Okay, we will see soon. And in the meantime, I will let you to judge who these people are, what they want, and up to you to analyze the historical contribution and what they're doing in on our current political scene. Okay, thank you so much, and I will see you next